Good morning, book lovers. This is Robert Boyd coming at you with another book report. This time, the book is Pinko Joe by Christopher Sperandio, or as I like to call him, Chris Sperandio. I've had this book in my possession for a few months now, given to me by Chris himself, and I haven't sat down and read it all the way through until a couple of days ago. But I had read a bunch of it in PDF format that Chris had provided me while he was working on it. Um, and this edition is published by a Canadian publisher called Argle Bargle, and I'll provide a link to them. In any case, Pinko Joe is a without the means of production are pretty important in this book, but without getting into that, first let me say Pinko Joe is a superhero from another dimension, a dimension ruled by ruthless capitalists, and on the world that he finds himself, it's a social democrat world. There still seems to be capitalism in the sense that there are businesses that are owned by people, but not gigantic, world-spanning monopolies like we have in our world. And he's constantly fighting evil capitalists as a member of the police force, the Metro Squad, and his archenemy is a guy called the Ultra Capitalist, who's also from his world. And there's as you can tell, there's a bit of a science fiction element, but essentially it's meant to be kind of a pastiche of old comics. And as such, the science fiction doesn't really work as science fiction because it's kind of crappy, but it's funny, and the way he writes is very funny and very enjoyable. So what he's done, I'm gonna just I'm sorry. I'm gonna skip back. Well, actually, you know what? I'm gonna talk about how he does it because I think that's important. He's looked through, as he writes in the afterword, thousands of old comic books, and he finds ones that are uh, in the public domain. So he doesn't want to violate copyright. I'm not totally sure why, but I guess not getting busted is good. Um, and he he scans them in, removes all the dialogue, looks at the pages, and imagines a story that'll work in those pages. Um, then he removes all the color and basically creates a new blue line. And I'm getting into sort of technical comic bookese. A blue line is and it's very. Let me add, it's not just technical comic-ese, it's kind of archaic comic-ese. But back in the old days, a blue line was the you take the line work and print it in light blue because light blue doesn't reproduce photographically for some technical reason that I don't really know. And he re-inked them. So old comics were done in an assembly line format where someone wrote the story, then someone penciled the story, which was meaning drew it with a pencil, and then someone else drew ink on it, and that was done because ink was easier to reproduce and then easier to color, and the coloring was a super laborious process, and because these were done in kind of a factory-like setting, where you churn them out as quickly and cheaply as possible. The coloring wasn't really very good in the old comics, in my opinion. You also often got kind of sloppy coloring just because these colorists were churning it out. Now, Chris, when he colors it, he has the luxury of using modern electronic means. He uses Photoshop, but in order to have a pay homage to the old comics that he's basically reusing, he limits his color palette the same way that old comics were limited, and he puts an additional color behind everything that uh, mimics the look of old paper. So it's slightly yellowed, and I'll show many examples of this. Um, and it has a kind of cool old fashioned look, and he does some of the things that comics would always do is like would be to give a main character a color. Um, you know, Scott McCloud talked about this in Understanding Comics, that in a way you could almost tell characters simply by glancing at the colors that they're colored in. The Hulk is always green body, purple pants. Superman, red, yellow, blue, etc. Um, and so the Pinko Joe has a dark tan skin, making him a non-white character. Although the characters that Sporandio is recreated to be Pinko Joe were white originally, I assume, and a bright pink suit. But he's always wearing a suit, not like a superhero costume. But it doesn't matter because the colors symbolize the character. Um, in any case, he the story is that he comes from a world of ultra capitalists, and has because he was leading a labor opposition, he was attacked by the ultra capitalists, and somehow their weapons sent him to our world, where he joins the police force and starts wailing on capitalists in this other world that is the setting of Pinko Joe. And his primary enemy comes from his original world, and he's called the ultra capitalist. He comes in. He's sort of a superhero. He looks a little bit like Adam Strange from the DC Comics. Um, so he has all this high tech gear, but he quickly abandons it because as we all know, with high tech gear, you run out of juice pretty quickly. If civilization comes to an end, 10 hours later, our phones stop working. And same is true with the ultra capitalist high tech gear, his gun, and his flying suit, etc. But he, quickly adapts to the look of that world, the Pinko Joe world, and starts muscling in on the capitalist activity there, and forms a gang called the 1% Gang. Now, what's amusing about this story is that the world that Pinko Joe finds himself in no way seems like a socialist world. People still own businesses. In his first case, there's a plant owned by kind of a rich old guy, but he's turned over operation of the plant to his beautiful young daughter. And there's no mention made that that's how capitalism works. That old white men run things and then give it to other members of their family. I mean, his beautiful young daughter could be Ivanka Trump, but not in this story. They're both dedicated social democrats, and also Pinko Joe is a cop. He's a freaking cop. And he's a cop who regularly, throughout the series, murders suspects in cold blood. So it's not exactly some sort of utopia. And it's not self-aware in that way. It's not like anyone saying, "Man, it's bad that we're killing these guys." And the way Chris writes it is that it's funny. The violence in it is funny. And that's all through. It's funny, and also the way they talk is funny because they don't they don't talk like 40s and 50s comic books. They talk like comedians of today, and they the cops, when Pinko Joe goes back to the station, they're like, "Hey, way to go, Joe! You really fucked up those capitalists." And that it is funny. I say read it and enjoy it because it is funny. They're like old comic books. They're like backup features. In the old days, comic books wouldn't have just one story, and they wouldn't just be 27 pages long like modern day uh, mainstream comics. They would have several stories, and usually there'd be a main one and some backup stories. And the backup story in this, one of the backup stories in this, is Little Trumpy, and it's sort of like a Dennis the Menace like kid comic, where the kid is actually Donald Trump, and he's saying things that Donald Trump has said that are outrageous and become all the more outrageous when spoken by a little kid. In any case, let me talk a little bit about Christopher Sporandio. He, aside from being very much into comics, as you can tell from this, he's a art professor at Rice University, my alma mater. Although he came to Rice long after I graduated, and he's kind of well known for prior to that, and actually since then, for a artistic collaboration with a guy named Simon Grennan. And I've reviewed Simon Grennan's graphic novel before. This is it, Dispossessed, and it's really good. And Chris has told me a little bit about the characters in it that Grennan uses photo reference a lot. But it has a very interesting drawing style, very sketchy, and I liked it a lot. The things they collaborated on, though, were nothing like that. They're actually closer to Pinko Joe, except that they're not appropriating any artwork. They were using photographs to create new comics, and basically many of them were in collaboration with a particular community. So they had a social practice aspect to them, which is something that Sporandio is a strong proponent of. This book, Cartoon Kings, is is sort of a catalog of their work together, which ends up looking like this, where a photograph with a really high definition without any sort of halftone is turned into a comic. And I have a bunch of those comics here in my apartment somewhere, and for the life of me I can't find them. And they are often quite amusing, and they were often for very specific projects. And that I think both Sporandio and Grennan are big lovers of comics. I mean, I think Grennan has gone on to become like a PhD in comics. And Sporandio basically came in as, I think, a painting professor, and now he's basically the comics professor. And he runs a library slash lab out of the art department at Rice University, filled with comics. I know I've donated a bunch of books to it, so it's kind of an exciting thing. I mean, it's exciting because when Chris was learning art and when I was learning art in college, nothing like that existed, as far as I know. And now there are a lot of people teaching comics in university at good art schools. I mean, not like small art departments like Rice Universities, but even the Art Institute of Chicago has its comics-oriented art professors. So anyway, congratulations, Chris, on a really great book that he tells us is the first of a trilogy. Now, I do want to go back to the fact that he's appropriating these works, and he's not crediting any of the artists whose work he's appropriating. And to be fair, he might not know who they are because basically, when comics started off, they didn't really credit people the way they do now. But I can assure you, someone knows who those artists were, those pencilers at least, because comics fans are like art historians or you know literary historians. They're always trying to figure out who did what. You'll go to the museum and you'll see some medieval painting or Greek pottery, and they'll be credited to the master of something, someplace. And it'll be because they don't really know who he was, but they know that he did a bunch of work in this place at a particular time. And comics fans, hardcore comics fans, and I wouldn't hesitate to call them comics scholars. A lot of what they've done is to do this, is to go into old comics and figure out, okay, based on stylistic things and the availability of different artists at that time, this comic book was probably done by this guy. And it was almost always a guy back in those days. So I wish Chris had figured out whose work he was appropriating. He's like a rapper using samples that are in the public domain, so he has the legal right to use them. But it's nice if the person who made that riff that gets sampled gets credit too. But that's life. That's life in the ultra-capitalist world in which we live. And part of in his afterward, not in the afterward, but in a interstitial, fun facts page, he does talk about copyright law. And I've actually taught copyright law versus comics to one of his classes once. And I have to say, at least one, and I think more than one of his students fell asleep during my lecture, so probably a good thing that I didn't ever become a college professor. Anyway, Pinko Joe, the ultra capitalist, their battles right here. Check it out.